Hey guys, tonight we are aiming true. The armies are gathering, but the battle is won here at the workbench. We are joining the medieval Fletcher. We are going to craft the projectile that ended the age of knights. This is a story about aerodynamics, balance, and the perfect line. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Now, watch the shavings fall, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The rain begins just after dawn. It is a soft rain, the kind that settles into the earth without violence, the kind that makes the world outside the workshop disappear into grey mist. Inside, the air is thick with the smell of animal glue. It is a sharp smell, acrid and warm, mingling with the sweeter scent of fresh-cut wood and the earthy must of sawdust that covers the floor in uneven drifts. The workshop is not large. A single room, perhaps 20 feet across, with a low ceiling crossed by dark beams that have held their position for generations. The walls are stone at the base, then timber above, and the light comes from a single window, shuttered now against the rain, leaving only the glow of two tallow candles to push back the shadows. The Fletcher works in silence. He has been awake for an hour, maybe two. Time moves differently in the early morning before the world begins its noise. He is a man of perhaps 40 years, though it is hard to say. His hands are what you notice first. They are broad and scarred, the fingertips stained dark from years of handling wood and sinew and glue. The nails are short, broken in places. These are not the hands of a nobleman. These are the hands of a craftsman who has spent his life in the service of a single purpose, the creation of the arrow. He sits on a low stool at his workbench, which is nothing more than a thick plank of oak, scarred and pitted from decades of cutting and planing and sanding. The surface is not smooth. It is a landscape of tiny valleys and ridges, each one a memory of work done. In front of him, arranged with the precision of a ritual, are his tools. A small hand plane, its wooden body worn smooth from use. A set of saws, their teeth fine and sharp. Files of different grades. Scrapers. Knives with blades ground to impassable thinness. And beside these, bundles of wood. Ash, mostly, some birch. A few pieces of hazel for special orders. The wood is stacked vertically against the wall, each piece selected and set aside for when it is needed. The rain continues. It is a steady sound, almost like breathing. The Fletcher does not seem to hear it. His attention is entirely on the piece of ash in his hands. It is a square stick, roughly 3 feet long and perhaps an inch across. The grain runs straight and true, which is what matters. Ash is the best wood for arrows. It is heavy enough to carry momentum, strong enough to survive the violence of release, and it grows straight, which saves time in the shaping. Other woods can be used. Birch is lighter, faster in the air, but it breaks more easily. Hazel is good for practice arrows, cheap and plentiful. But for a war arrow, an arrow meant to punch through mail or the layered linen of a gambeson, ash is the only choice. The Fletcher turns the stick slowly in his hands, running his fingertips along the grain. He is feeling for imperfections, a knot, a twist in the fiber, anything that might compromise the shaft. The wood must be perfect, or as close to perfect as nature allows. An arrow is not a complicated thing. It is a stick with a point and feathers. But within that simplicity is a level of precision that most people never consider. An arrow that is not straight will not fly true. An arrow that is not balanced will tumble in the air. An arrow that is too heavy will drop short of its target. Too light, and it will be caught by the wind. Every part of the arrow must work in harmony, and it all begins with the wood. He finds what he is looking for. A section of the stick, perhaps 2 feet long, where the grain runs without deviation. He marks it with a piece of charcoal, a single line across the wood, then sets it aside and reaches for his saw. The saw is small, designed for fine work, and the blade is thin enough that he can see light through it when he holds it up to the candle. He positions the stick on the bench, bracing it with his knee, and begins to cut. The sound is quiet, a whispering rasp that barely rises above the rain. The saw moves smoothly through the wood, guided by years of practice. There is no hurry. Hurrying leads to mistakes, and mistakes mean waste, and waste is something a Fletcher cannot afford. The piece comes free, and he sets the saw aside. Now he has a stick of ash, 2 feet long, square in cross-section with the grain running true. This will become an arrow. But first it must be shaped. The square must become a cylinder. The rough must become smooth. The potential must become the real. He picks up the hand plane. It is a beautiful tool, simple in design but elegant in function. The body is beech, dark with age and oil from his hands. The blade is steel, honed to an edge so sharp that it will slice through paper with the weight of the blade alone. He adjusts the blade, turning the small wooden wedge that holds it in place, checking the depth of the cut with his thumb. Too deep, and the plane will tear the wood. Too shallow, and it will do nothing. He sets the stick in a simple jig, 2 pieces of wood nailed to the bench to hold the shaft steady, and positions the plane at one end. The first stroke is always tentative, a test. He pushes the plane forward, and the blade bites into the wood. There is resistance, then release, and a thin curl of ash peels away from the shaft, falling to the bench in a perfect spiral. The smell of fresh wood rises, clean and sweet. He continues, stroke after stroke, working his way down the length of the shaft. The plane removes the corners of the square, turning it into an octagon. 8 flat sides, each one a facet that catches the candlelight. The curls of wood pile up on the bench, on the floor, gathering like snowdrifts in the corners of the workshop. The work is meditative. There is no thinking involved, not in the conscious sense. His hands know what to do. They have done this thousands of times, tens of thousands. The plane moves in a rhythm, a steady beat that matches the rain outside. Scrape, curl, scrape, curl. The sound is soft, almost musical. The octagon becomes a cylinder, and the cylinder becomes smooth. He rotates the shaft in the jig, checking for high spots, areas where the wood is still thick. He finds one and removes it with a few careful strokes. The goal is uniformity. Every part of the shaft must be the same diameter, the same weight. Any variation will affect the flight of the arrow, and in battle, that variation can mean the difference between a hit and a miss, between a man standing and a man on the ground. He works for perhaps an hour, maybe more. Time is irrelevant. The only thing that matters is the wood and the plane and the slow transformation taking place beneath his hands. Eventually, he sets the plane aside and picks up the shaft. It is no longer square. It is round, or nearly so. He holds it up to the light, sighting down its length, checking for straightness. The shaft is true. No bends, no curves. He rolls it on the bench, listening to the sound it makes. A straight shaft will roll smoothly, with a consistent sound. A bent shaft will wobble, tapping against the wood in an uneven rhythm. This one is silent, except for the soft hiss of wood on wood. Good. But it is not finished. The surface is still rough, covered in tiny ridges left by the plain blade. These must be removed. An arrow shaft must be smooth, not just for aesthetics, but for function. A rough shaft creates turbulence in the air, slowing the arrow. It also catches on the bowstring, affecting release. Smoothness is not optional. It is essential. The Fletcher sets the shaft aside and reaches for a piece of dried fish skin, dogfish specifically. The skin of a small shark, dried and stretched, covered in tiny, hard scales that act like sandpaper. It is one of the Fletcher's most valuable tools, and he treats it with care, keeping it wrapped in oiled cloth when not in use. He wraps the dogfish skin around the shaft, gripping it firmly, and begins to rub. The sound is different now. A scratching, rasping sound, harsher than the plain but still rhythmic. The scales on the skin are abrading the wood, removing the ridges, smoothing the surface. He works methodically, moving from one end of the shaft to the other, turning the shaft as he goes to ensure even coverage. The wood begins to warm under the friction. He can feel the heat building in his hands, a gentle warmth that speaks of work being done. The scratching continues, back and forth, around and around. The dogfish skin darkens as it picks up the fine dust of the ash, and the shaft begins to glow in the candlelight, the grain of the wood becoming more visible as the surface smooths. Some fletchers use horsedale instead of dogfish skin. Horsedale is a plant, a strange thing that grows in damp places with a hollow stem covered in ridges of silica. When dried, it becomes almost as abrasive as the fish skin, and it is cheaper, easier to find. The Fletcher has used horsedale many times, and it works well enough. But he prefers the dogfish skin. It lasts longer, and it gives a finer finish. In the end, the choice of abrasive is less important than the patience to use it properly. Smoothing a shaft is not quick work. It requires time, attention, and a willingness to do the same motion again and again until the result is perfect. He continues for another hour, perhaps longer. The rain outside has not stopped. If anything, it has intensified, a steady drumming on the thatch roof that would be soothing if he were lying in bed instead of working. But he is not in bed. He is here in the workshop, doing what he has always done, making arrows. Eventually, he stops and examines the shaft. He runs his hand down its length, feeling for rough spots. There are none. The surface is smooth, almost silky. He holds it up to the candle again, turning it slowly. The light plays across the grain of the ash, highlighting the subtle variations in color, the way the fibers interlock and support each other. It is beautiful in its way. Not the beauty of a painting or a piece of jewelry, but the beauty of function, of a thing made perfectly for its purpose. Now comes one of the most delicate parts of the process, the nock. The nock is the slot cut into the back end of the arrow, the place where the bowstring sits. It seems like a small thing, almost trivial, but it is anything but. The nock must be deep enough to hold the string securely, but not so deep that it weakens the shaft. It must be wide enough to accommodate the thickness of the string, but not so wide that the arrow falls off when the bow is tilted. It must be smooth, without splinters or rough edges that might catch on the string and affect release. And it must be reinforced, because the violence of release puts enormous stress on this small slot. And without reinforcement, the wood will split. The Fletcher picks up a small saw. This is not the saw he used to cut the shaft to length. This is a finer tool, with teeth so small they are almost invisible. A saw for detail work, for cuts that must be precise. He marks the location of the nock with a piece of charcoal, a small line across the end of the shaft. Then he positions the shaft in a V-shaped block on the bench, holding it steady with one hand, and begins to cut. The saw moves slowly, carefully. He is cutting with the grain, which is always dangerous. Wood wants to split along the grain, and if he pushes too hard or cuts too deep, the entire shaft could crack. So he goes slowly, letting the saw do the work, guiding it with gentle pressure. The cut deepens. A thin slot appears in the end of the shaft, perhaps a quarter-inch deep. He stops and checks the depth with his thumbnail, not deep enough yet. He continues cutting, stopping frequently to check his progress. The goal is a nock that is about 3/8 of an inch deep, centered perfectly on the shaft. Too far to one side and the arrow will fly crooked. Too shallow and the string will slip off. Too deep and the shaft will break. Finally, after what seems like an eternity but is probably only a few minutes, he is satisfied. The nock is the right depth. He sets the saw aside and picks up a small file, using it to smooth the inside of the slot, rounding the bottom slightly so there are no sharp edges to catch the string. But the nock is not finished. Wood, even ash, is not strong enough to withstand the repeated stress of a bowstring slamming into it. The slot needs reinforcement, and for this the Fletcher uses horn. He has a small piece of cow horn, pale and translucent, soaking in a bowl of water on the bench. Horn, when dry, is hard and brittle, but when soaked, it becomes pliable, easy to work. He removes the horn from the water and shakes off the excess. Using a small knife, he cuts a thin sliver, perhaps an inch long and no thicker than a fingernail. He shapes it carefully, tapering the ends, making sure the width matches the slot in the nock. Then he reaches for the glue part. The glue part sits on a small iron stand over a candle, keeping the contents warm and liquid. The glue is made from animal hide, boiled down until it forms a thick, sticky syrup. When hot, it flows like honey. When cool, it sets harder than wood. The Fletcher dips a small brush into the part and applies a thin layer of glue to the inside of the knock slot. Then he takes the horn sliver and presses it into the slot, working it down until it sits flush with the wood. The excess glue squeezes out, and he wipes it away with a rag. The horn will reinforce the knock, preventing the wood from splitting, and it will last for the life of the arrow, which might be 1 shot or 100, depending on what it hits. He sets the shaft aside to let the glue dry and reaches for another piece of ash. The process begins again. Select the wood, feel the grain, cut to length, shape with the plane, smooth with the dogfish skin, cut the knock, reinforce with horn. It is the same sequence every time, repeated with the consistency of a prayer. There is comfort in the repetition, a sense of order in a world that often has none. Outside, men are preparing for war. They are sharpening swords, mending armor, drilling in formations. They are thinking about glory and honor and the spoils of victory. But here, in this small workshop, the Fletcher is thinking about grain and balance and the perfect curve of a wood shaving. He works through the morning, through the afternoon. The rain does not stop. The candles burn down and he replaces them. The pile of wood shavings on the floor grows deeper. One shaft is finished, then another, then another. Each one is examined with the same critical eye, held up to the light, rolled on the bench, tested for straightness. Some pass the test and are set aside in a rack on the wall. Others do not, and they are added to a pile in the corner to be used for kindling or practice shafts. The Fletcher does not keep a bad shaft. There is no point. A bad shaft is worse than no shaft at all, because it creates the illusion of readiness without the reality. By the time the light outside begins to fade, he has completed 7 shafts. 7 perfect cylinders of ash, each one identical in length and diameter, each one straight and smooth and strong. 7 knocks, each one reinforced with horn. They are not yet arrows. They still need points, the iron or steel tips that will do the actual work of piercing armor and flesh. They still need fletching, the feathers that will stabilize the arrow in flight. But they are close. They are the foundation upon which everything else will be built. The Fletcher stands and stretches, feeling the stiffness in his back from hours of bending over the bench. He is tired, but it is a good tiredness, the kind that comes from honest work. He walks to the window and pushes open the shutter. The rain has slowed to a drizzle. The world outside is wet and grey, but there is a break in the clouds to the west, a thin line of light that promises better weather tomorrow. He breathes in the damp air, clearing his lungs of sawdust and glue fumes. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rings, marking the hour. He does not know which hour. It does not matter. He returns to the bench and begins to clean up. The wood shavings are swept into a pile and transferred to a basket. They will be used to start fires or mixed with the manure in the stable to help it compost. Nothing is wasted. The tools are wiped clean and hung on their pegs on the wall. The glue part is moved away from the candle, allowed to cool. The shafts are placed carefully in the rack, each one separated from the next so they do not touch. They will sit there overnight, the glue in the knocks drying completely, and tomorrow he will begin the next stage of the process. But for now, the work is done. The Fletcher blows out the candles, plunging the workshop into darkness. He steps outside, pulling the door closed behind him. The air is cold and clean, and the rain has left everything smelling of earth and stone. He crosses the small courtyard to his house, a modest structure attached to the workshop, and goes inside. There is a fire in the hearth and the smell of cooking. His wife looks up from the pot she is stirring and nods. No words are exchanged. None are needed. He sits at the table, and she brings him a bowl of pottage, thick with barley and onions and a bit of salted pork. He eats slowly, savoring each bite, his hands still stained with glue and wood dust. The arrows he made today will be sold to a lord's steward, who will distribute them to archers in the lord's retinue. Those archers will carry them to wherever the next battle is fought, and they will loose them at men they have never met, men who have done them no personal wrong. Some of the arrows will miss. Some will strike shields or armor and bounce away. But some will find their mark, will slip between the joints of a helmet or find the gap in a coat of plates, and they will kill. The Fletcher knows this. He has always known this. It is the nature of his work. He makes tools of death, and he makes them as well as he can, because that is what a craftsman does. But he does not dwell on this. He cannot afford to. If he thought too much about where his arrows ended up, about the men they killed or the families they left behind, he would go mad. So he focuses on the work itself, on the satisfaction of taking a piece of raw wood and transforming it into something functional and beautiful. He focuses on the grain and the balance and the perfect line. That is enough. It has to be enough. After he eats, he sits by the fire for a while, letting the warmth seep into his bones. His wife sits across from him, mending a shirt by the firelight. They do not talk much. They have been married for 20 years, and all the necessary words have been said. But the silence is comfortable, companionable. Outside, the rain has stopped entirely, and the clouds are beginning to break up. Stars appear in the gaps, cold and distant. The Fletcher watches them for a while, then stands and makes his way to bed. Tomorrow he will start again. More wood to select, more shafts to plane, more knocks to cut. The work is never finished. As long as there are wars, there will be a need for arrows, and as long as there is a need for arrows, there will be work for a Fletcher. He lies down and closes his eyes, and within minutes he is asleep. He dreams, as he often does, of wood, of forests of ash trees, their branches reaching toward the sky, their roots deep in the earth, of the grain running straight and true, waiting to be found, to be shaped, to be made into something more than it is. It is a peaceful dream, and he sleeps soundly, the rain-washed air drifting through the open window, carrying with it the scent of the workshop, of sawdust and glue and the promise of work to come. The next morning dawns clear and cold. Frost covers the ground, and the Fletcher's breath mists in the air as he crosses from the house to the workshop. Inside, the shafts are waiting for him, still in their rack. He examines them one by one, checking that the glue has set properly, that the horn reinforcements are secure. They are. Everything is as it should be. He selects one of the shafts and carries it to the bench. Today he will begin the process of adding the point, the business end of the arrow. But before that, there is more work to be done on the shaft itself. Even though the shaft has been planed and sanded smooth, it is not yet perfect. The Fletcher knows this. Perfection in wood is an ideal, something to strive for but never quite achieve. There are always small imperfections, tiny variations in diameter or subtle irregularities in the grain. These imperfections may not be visible to the eye, but they can be felt, and more importantly, they can affect the flight of the arrow. So the Fletcher takes a scraper, a simple tool made from a thin piece of steel with a burr turned up on the edge, and he begins to work over the shaft one more time. The scraper removes wood differently than the plane or the sandpaper. It does not cut or abrade. Instead, it burnishes, taking off the finest possible layer of wood and leaving behind a surface that is not just smooth but polished. The Fletcher works slowly, holding the shaft in one hand and the scraper in the other, pulling the tool toward him in long, even strokes. The sound is different from the plane or the sandpaper. It is a whispering sound, almost inaudible, and it produces not shavings or dust, but the finest particles of wood, so small they float in the air like motes in a beam of sunlight. He continues this process for perhaps 30 minutes, working over every inch of the shaft. By the time he is finished, the surface of the ash has a subtle sheen, and when he runs his hand down the length, it feels not like wood, but like something else, something alive and warm. This is what he is looking for. This is the level of finish that will allow the arrow to slip through the air with the least resistance, that will allow it to fly true and fast. He sets the shaft aside and picks up the next one, beginning the process again. The work is tedious, but the Fletcher does not mind. He has done this for so long that it has become a part of him, like breathing. His hands move without conscious thought, guided by muscle memory and years of practice. He can feel when the surface is right, when the wood has given up its roughness and become something more refined. It is a subtle thing, almost impossible to explain to someone who has not spent their life working with wood. But it is real, and it matters. By midday, he has finished scraping all 7 shafts. They sit in the rack, gleaming in the light from the window. He allows himself a moment of satisfaction, then moves on to the next task. The points. Arrow points come in many different types, each one designed for a specific purpose. Bodkin points, long and narrow, designed to punch through mail. Broadheads, wide and sharp, designed to cut through flesh and create devastating wounds. Blunt points, designed to stun rather than kill, used for hunting birds or small game. Barbed points, designed to stick in the target and be difficult to remove. The type of point depends on the customer's needs, and the customer for these arrows has specified bodkins. War arrows. Arrows meant to kill armored men. The Fletcher does not make the points himself. That is the work of a blacksmith, someone skilled in working metal. But the Fletcher must attach the points to the shafts, and this requires skill of a different kind. The challenge is that wood and metal have different properties. Wood expands and contracts with changes in temperature and humidity. Metal does not. If the point is attached too tightly, the wood will crack when it dries. If it is attached too loosely, the point will come off in flight or on impact. The solution is a carefully fitted tang, the part of the point that inserts into the shaft, combined with the right type of adhesive. The bodkin points are sitting in a small wooden box on the bench. The Fletcher takes one out and examines it. It is a simple piece of work, but effective. A pyramid-shaped head, about 2 inches long, tapering to a sharp point. Behind the head is a socket, a hollow tube of metal into which the shaft will fit. The socket is slightly tapered, narrower at the open end than at the base, which will help create a tight fit. The metal is dark, covered in a thin layer of scale from the forging process. The Fletcher takes a piece of fine sand and rubs the socket, cleaning away the scale, exposing the bare metal underneath. He picks up one of the finished shafts and examines the front end, the end opposite the knock. It needs to be shaped to fit the socket of the point. Using a small knife, he begins to carefully taper the end of the shaft, removing wood in thin slices. He works slowly, checking the fit frequently by sliding the socket over the tapered end. Too much wood, and the socket will not slide on. Too little, and the fit will be loose. He is looking for a point where the socket slides on with firm resistance, tight enough that it will not come off, but not so tight that it splits the wood. After several minutes of careful work, he achieves the right fit. The socket slides onto the shaft with a satisfying resistance, and when he tries to twist it, it does not move. Good, but the fit alone is not enough. The point must be glued in place, and for this, the Fletcher uses a different type of glue than the hide glue he used for the knock reinforcement. He uses pine pitch mixed with a bit of beeswax and charcoal. Pitch is waterproof, which is important because arrows are often stored outside or used in wet conditions. It is also somewhat flexible, which allows it to absorb the shock of impact without cracking. The Fletcher has a small pot of pitch warming over a candle. He removes the point from the shaft and uses a small stick to apply pitch to the inside of the socket, coating it thoroughly. Then he applies pitch to the tapered end of the shaft. He works quickly because pitch cools and hardens fast. Once both surfaces are coated, he slides the socket back onto the shaft, pushing it on as far as it will go. Excess pitch squeezes out, and he wipes it away with a rag. Then he holds the arrow upright, point down, and taps the knock end lightly against the bench. This drives the point more firmly onto the shaft, ensuring good contact. He sets the arrow aside, point up, and allows the pitch to cool and harden. In a few minutes, the bond will be as strong as the wood itself. He repeats this process for the remaining 6 shafts, working methodically. Taper the end, check the fit, Apply pitch, slide the point on, tap it tight, set it aside. By the time he finishes, the afternoon light is slanting through the window at a steep angle. The arrows are starting to look like arrows now. They have shafts and points and nocks, but they are still missing the most important component, the part that will make them fly, the fletching. Fletching is the name for the feathers attached to the back of the arrow. Most people, if they think about arrows at all, assume the feathers are decorative. They are not. The feathers are what make the arrow stable in flight. When an arrow is released from a bow, it is not perfectly balanced. The point is much heavier than the back end, which means the arrow wants to tumble, to flip end over end as it flies through the air. The feathers prevent this by creating drag at the back of the arrow, which keeps the point facing forward. Without feathers, an arrow would be useless, tumbling wildly and landing nowhere near the target. The type of feather matters. The Fletcher uses goose feathers, taken from the wing. Wing feathers are long and strong, with a natural curve that helps them grip the air. The Fletcher has bundles of feathers stored in a barrel in the corner of the workshop, sorted by size and quality. He selects a handful of the best ones, feathers that are straight and undamaged, with strong quills. He brings them to the bench and begins the process of preparing them. First, the feathers must be split. Each feather has a quill running down the center and the veins on either side of the quill. The Fletcher only needs one side of each feather, so he takes a sharp knife and carefully splits each feather down the center of the quill, creating two halves. This is delicate work. If he cuts too close to one side, that half of the feather will be too narrow and weak. If he cuts too far from the center, he wastes material. He has done this so many times that he can do it almost without looking, the knife following the line of the quill with the precision of long practice. Once the feathers are split, they must be shaped. The Fletcher uses a pattern, a simple piece of thin wood cut to the shape he wants. He lays the pattern on one of the feather halves and uses a sharp knife to cut around it, creating a fletch that is about 4 inches long and tapers from about 3/4 of an inch wide at the front to half an inch at the back. The shape is important. Too wide, and the fletching will create too much drag, slowing the arrow. Too narrow, and it will not provide enough stabilization. The taper helps the fletching to flex and grip the air without creating excessive resistance. He cuts 3 fletching pieces for each arrow, working carefully to ensure they are all the same size and shape. Consistency is everything. If one fletching is larger or smaller than the others, the arrow will spiral in flight, and the aim will be off. Once he has cut the fletching pieces, he trims the quills, removing the excess and leaving just enough to attach the fletching to the shaft. Then he takes each piece and runs it over a candle flame, quickly, just enough to singe the edges slightly. This seals the fibers of the feather, preventing them from splitting or fraying in use. Now comes the attachment. The fletching must be glued to the shaft in a very specific way. The 3 pieces are spaced evenly around the circumference of the shaft, 120 degrees apart. One of the pieces, called the cock feather, is positioned perpendicular to the nock, so that when the arrow is placed on the bowstring, the cock feather points away from the bow. This is important because when the arrow is released, it must pass the bow without the fletching hitting the wood. The other 2 feathers, called the hen feathers, are positioned on either side. The Fletcher takes one of the arrows and marks the positions of the fletching with small dots of charcoal. Then he applies a thin line of hide glue along the quill of the first fletching piece and presses it onto the shaft, holding it in place for a few seconds while the glue begins to set. He does the same with the other 2 pieces, checking carefully to make sure they are positioned correctly. The fletching must be aligned with the shaft, not twisted or angled. Even a small misalignment will cause the arrow to spin irregularly in flight. Once the fletching is attached, the Fletcher takes a length of fine linen thread and begins to wrap the ends of the quills, binding them tightly to the shaft. This reinforces the glue joint and ensures the fletching will not come loose in use. He wraps the thread in a tight spiral, overlapping each turn slightly, creating a smooth, even surface. When he reaches the end, he tucks the thread under the last few wraps and pulls it tight, then cuts off the excess. He applies a small dab of glue to the wrapping to seal it, and the fletching is complete. He steps back and examines the arrow. It is finished. A shaft of ash, 3 feet long, straight and smooth. A bodkin point at the front, sharp and deadly. A knock at the back, reinforced with horn. 3 goose feathers, perfectly aligned, creating the drag that will stabilize the arrow in flight. It is a simple thing, really. A stick with a point and feathers. But it is also a masterpiece of precision engineering, a tool designed to do one job and do it perfectly. To fly straight and fast and true, to carry the force of the bowstring across hundreds of yards, to punch through armor and end a life. The Fletcher holds the arrow up to the light, sighting down its length one more time. It is straight, it is balanced, it is perfect. He sets it aside and picks up the next shaft, beginning the process again. Split the feathers, cut the fletching, singe the edges, mark the positions, apply the glue, attach the fletching, wrap with thread. 1 arrow done, 6 more to go. The work continues, the same sequence repeated with the same care and attention. There is no room for shortcuts, no place for sloppy work. Each arrow must be as good as the one before it, because the Fletcher's reputation depends on it. A Fletcher who makes poor arrows will not have work for long. Men who go into battle with bad arrows do not come back, and the ones who do come back remember who made the arrows that failed them. By the time he finishes the last arrow, it is late evening. The light from the window has faded, and he is working by candlelight again. His back aches, and his hands are stiff from hours of fine work. But the 7 arrows are complete, standing in a rack on the bench like soldiers at attention. He allows himself a moment of pride, then begins the final inspection. He picks up each arrow in turn, checking it one more time. He rolls it on the bench, listening for any sound that might indicate a bend or warp. He examines the fletching, making sure it is secure. He tests the point, checking that it is firmly attached. Every arrow passes inspection. They are ready. Tomorrow he will deliver them to the steward, who will pay him a few pennies per arrow. It is not much, but it is enough. Enough to buy more wood, more feathers, more glue and pitch and horn. Enough to feed his family and keep the workshop going. Enough to continue doing the work he has done all his life. The Fletcher does not think much about the future. He does not wonder what will happen when he is too old to work, or what his wife will do if he dies. Those are problems for another day. Today he made 7 arrows, and they are good arrows, arrows that will fly true and do what they are meant to do. That is enough. He cleans up the workshop, sweeping away the feather scraps and the thread ends, wiping down the bench, hanging the tools on their pegs. He checks the glue part, making sure it is cool before covering it. He blows out the candles and steps outside. The night is clear and cold, and the stars are brilliant overhead. He can see the Milky Way, a river of light stretching across the sky. He stands there for a moment, breathing in the cold air, feeling the tiredness in his body, but also a sense of satisfaction. He has done good work today. That is all a craftsman can ask for. He goes inside, to the warmth of the fire and the smell of dinner cooking. His wife looks up and smiles, and he smiles back. They eat together, talking quietly about small things. What needs to be done tomorrow? The neighbor's new cow, the price of grain at the market, ordinary things, the fabric of daily life. After dinner, he sits by the fire again, watching the flames dance. He thinks about the arrows, about where they will go and what they will do, but he does not think about it for long. That is not his concern. His concern is the work, the craft, the transformation of raw materials into something functional and beautiful. Everything else is beyond his control. Eventually, he makes his way to bed. He lies down, and his wife lies down beside him. Outside, the world is quiet. The rain has not returned. The stars continue their slow wheel across the sky. And in the workshop, the arrows wait, patient and silent, ready for whatever comes next. The Fletcher closes his eyes and sleeps, and he dreams again of wood, of forests and grain and the perfect line. It is always the same dream, and it is always enough. The morning comes with frost on the windows. The Fletcher wakes before dawn, as he always does, and lies in bed for a moment, listening to the silence. His wife sleeps beside him, her breathing slow and steady. Outside, nothing moves. The world is still, waiting for the sun. He rises quietly, dressing in the cold air, pulling on his worn wool tunic and leather apron. His breath mists in front of his face. He crosses from the house to the workshop, his footsteps crunching on the frost-covered ground. Inside the workshop, the air is even colder than outside. No fire has burned here overnight, and the stone walls hold the chill like a vault. But the Fletcher does not mind. He is used to this. He lights 2 candles, their flames small and wavering in the still air, and sets them on the bench. The light pushes back the darkness just enough for him to see. He looks at the 7 arrows standing in their rack, the work from yesterday. Shafts and points and nocks, but still incomplete. Still missing the most critical component, the fletching. He crosses to the barrel in the corner and removes the lid. Inside are feathers. Hundreds of them, sorted and bundled, tied with string. Most are from geese, taken from the wings during the autumn slaughter when the birds are killed for meat and fat. The Fletcher buys them from farmers, or sometimes he trades arrows for them. A good wing feather is valuable, worth almost as much as the arrow it will become part of. The feathers must be perfect. No broken quills, no damaged veins, no gaps in the barbs that hold the feather together. A damaged feather will not provide the stability the arrow needs, and a Fletcher who uses damaged feathers is a Fletcher who will not have customers for long. He selects a bundle and brings it to the bench. The feathers are long, perhaps 8 or 9 inches from tip to base, with a strong quill running down the center. On either side of the quill are the vanes, the soft, flexible parts of the feather that will catch the air and stabilize the arrow in flight. The feathers have a natural curve to them, a gentle arc that comes from being part of a living wing. This curve is important. When attached to the arrow, the curve will cause the arrow to spin slightly as it flies, like a thrown spear, and this spin adds stability. An arrow that spins will fly straighter and farther than one that does not. The Fletcher picks up the first feather and examines it closely. He holds it up to the candlelight, turning it slowly, looking for any flaws. The quill is straight and strong. The vanes are intact, the barbs interlocked perfectly, creating a smooth, continuous surface. This is a good feather. He sets it aside and picks up another, repeating the inspection. Good, and another. Good. He continues until he has selected enough feathers for the 7 arrows. 21 feathers in total, 3 per arrow. Each one examined, each one approved. Now comes the splitting. Each feather must be divided down the center of the quill, creating 2 halves. The Fletcher will use 1 half and discard the other, or save it for smaller arrows or practice shafts. He picks up his knife, a small blade with an edge honed to impossible sharpness, and selects the first feather. He holds the feather in his left hand, quill side up, and positions the knife at the base of the quill. Then, with a smooth, steady motion, he draws the knife forward, letting the blade follow the natural line of the quill. The sound is distinct, a soft cracking, almost like ice breaking on a pond, as the quill splits along its length. The knife moves through the feather in one continuous stroke, from base to tip, and the feather falls into 2 halves. He sets 1 half aside and examines the other. The quill is cleanly split, exposing the hollow interior. The vane is still intact, held together by thousands of tiny barbs that hook onto each other like the teeth of a comb. He runs his thumb along the edge of the quill, feeling for any rough spots or splinters. There are none. The split is clean. He sets this half aside and picks up the next feather. The knife moves again. The soft, cracking sound. Another feather split. He works methodically, not hurrying, splitting feather after feather. The sound becomes a rhythm. Crack, crack, crack. The pile of split feathers grows. When he has split all 21 feathers, he sets the knife aside and picks up his pattern. This is a simple tool, a thin piece of wood or horn cut to the exact shape he wants the fletching to be. The pattern is perhaps 4 inches long and tapers from about 3/4 of an inch at the wide end to half an inch at the narrow end. The Fletcher has used this pattern for years, and the edges are worn smooth from handling. He places the pattern on one of the split feather halves, aligning it carefully with the quill, and picks up his knife again. The knife cuts around the pattern, trimming away the excess feather, leaving behind a piece that matches the pattern exactly. The vein is cut to shape, and the quill is trimmed to a manageable length, leaving just enough to attach the fletching to the shaft. The Fletcher works with precision, his hands steady, the knife moving in smooth, controlled strokes. The trimmed pieces of feather fall to the bench, light as air, drifting in the slight currents created by his movements. He continues, cutting one fletching piece after another, each one identical to the last. The consistency is what matters. 3 pieces of fletching on an arrow, and all 3 must be exactly the same size and shape, or the arrow will not fly true. By the time he finishes cutting, the light outside has strengthened. Dawn is breaking, though the sun has not yet appeared over the horizon. The workshop is still cold, but the Fletcher does not notice. He is focused on the work, on the pile of fletching pieces in front of him, each one perfect, each one ready to become part of an arrow. He picks up one of the pieces and examines it closely. The edge of the vein is slightly rough where the knife cut through the barbs. This needs to be sealed, or the fletching will begin to fray in use, the barbs separating and creating gaps that will affect the arrow's flight. He lights a third candle and holds the fletching piece over the flame, moving it quickly, just close enough for the heat to singe the edges. The smell of burning feather rises, sharp and acrid. The edges of the vein curl slightly, then set, the barbs fuse together by the heat. The Fletcher works carefully, holding the fletching just above the flame, turning it to expose all the edges. Too close, and the feather will catch fire. Too far, and the heat will have no effect. He has done this thousands of times, and his hands know exactly the right distance, the right speed. The fletching passes over the flame, the edges singe and seal, and he sets it aside. 1 done, 20 more to go. The work continues. Fletching after fletching held over the flame, edges singed and sealed. The smell of burning feather fills the workshop, mixing with the ever-present scent of sawdust and glue. The pile of finished fletching pieces grows. Finally, all 21 are done. The Fletcher sets them aside and turns his attention to the glue part. The glue part sits on a small iron stand, and beneath it is a candle that will keep the contents warm and liquid. The part itself is made of iron, blackened from years of use, and inside is the glue. The Fletcher makes his glue from rabbit skin, boiled down until the collagen breaks apart and forms a thick, sticky liquid. Some Fletchers use fish glue, made from the swim bladders of sturgeon or cod, and this works well too, perhaps even better in wet conditions. But the Fletcher prefers rabbit skin glue. It is stronger when dry, and it sets faster, which is important when working with fletching that must be held in place while the glue cures. He lights the candle beneath the glue part and waits. The glue is solid now, a thick brown mass that looks almost like dark honey that has crystallized. As the heat from the candle warms the part, the glue begins to soften, to liquefy. The Fletcher stirs it with a small stick, breaking up the solid mass, helping it melt. The smell of the glue rises, warm and slightly sweet, with an undertone of something organic, something that was once alive. It is not an unpleasant smell, though some people find it so. To the Fletcher, it is simply the smell of work, as familiar as the smell of wood or feather. After a few minutes, the glue is fully liquid. The Fletcher tests it by dipping the stick in and lifting it up. The glue should run off the stick in a smooth, continuous stream. If it is too thick, it will glob and drip. If it is too thin, it will not hold. This glue is perfect. It flows like honey, thick but pourable, sticky but workable. He sets the stick aside and picks up a small brush, just a few hairs bound to a stick with thread. He dips the brush into the glue, coating the bristles, then lets the excess drip back into the pot. The glue clings to the brush, ready to be applied. He picks up one of the arrows from the rack and examines the shaft. Yesterday, he marked 3 positions on the shaft, 120 degrees apart, where the fletching will be attached. The marks are still visible, small darts of charcoal. One of the marks is positioned perpendicular to the nark. This is where the cock feather will go. The other 2 marks are for the hen feathers. The fletcher picks up one of the fletching pieces and applies a thin line of glue along the quill, running from one end to the other. The glue is warm and it spreads easily, coating the quill in a smooth, even layer. Then he positions the fletching on the shaft, aligning the quill with one of the charcoal marks. He presses it down gently, holding it in place. The glue is tacky, and the fletching wants to stick immediately, but the fletcher is careful. He checks the alignment, making sure the fletching is straight, not twisted or angled. Even a small deviation will affect the arrow's flight, causing it to spin irregularly or drift off course. Satisfied that the fletching is positioned correctly, he presses it more firmly against the shaft and holds it there for a few seconds, allowing the glue to begin setting. He repeats the process with the second fletching piece, applying glue, positioning it on the shaft, checking the alignment, pressing it down. Then the third piece, the cock feather, positioned perpendicular to the nark. The 3 pieces of fletching are now attached to the shaft, evenly spaced, perfectly aligned. But the glue alone is not enough. The glue joint must be reinforced with thread, bound tightly to ensure the fletching will not come loose in use. An arrow can be loosed dozens of times, hundreds if it is used for practice, and never hits anything hard. Each time it is loosed, the fletching experiences tremendous stress as the arrow accelerates from 0 to perhaps 150 feet per second in a fraction of a second. Without the binding, the glue would eventually fail, and the fletching would tear away. The fletcher picks up a spool of silk thread. Silk is the best material for binding fletching, stronger than linen or wool and thinner, which means it adds less weight to the arrow. The thread is expensive, one of the most costly materials the fletcher uses, but it is worth it. A well-bound fletching will last for the life of the arrow, and the thread is so thin and light that it does not affect the balance. He cuts a length of thread, perhaps 2 feet long, and sets one end against the shaft, just behind the front edge of the fletching where the quill begins. He holds the thread in place with his thumb and begins to wrap. The thread goes around the shaft, over the quill of the fletching, trapping it against the wood. Loop, pull, loop, pull. The thread wraps in a tight spiral, each turn overlapping the previous one slightly, creating a smooth, even surface. The fletcher's hands move with practiced efficiency, the thread flowing through his fingers, the wrapping growing with each turn. Loop, pull, loop, pull. The rhythm is hypnotic, almost meditative. The sound of the thread pulling tight, the feel of it under his fingers, the growing spiral of silk catching the light. He continues wrapping, moving slowly along the length of the quill, covering it completely. The thread must be tight enough to hold the fletching securely, but not so tight that it cuts into the quill and weakens it. The fletcher knows the right tension by feel, the same way he knows the right depth for a nark or the right temperature for glue. It is not something that can be taught, not really. It must be learned through repetition, through making mistakes and correcting them, through thousands and thousands of arrows. Loop, pull, loop, pull. The wrapping continues until he reaches the back edge of the fletching where the quill ends. Now comes the tricky part. The thread must be secured, tied off in a way that will not unravel. The fletcher makes a small loop in the thread, then passes the working end through the loop, pulling it tight. This creates a simple knot, but it is not enough. He makes another loop, another knot, then another. 3 knots in total, each one pulled tight against the previous one. Then he trims the excess thread with his knife, cutting as close to the last knot as possible. A small dab of glue on the knots seals them, and the binding is complete. He repeats the process for the other 2 fletching pieces, wrapping each quill with thread, securing each with knots and glue. The work takes time, perhaps 15 minutes per arrow, But there is no way to rush it. Each step must be done carefully, precisely. A poorly bound fletching will fail, and a failed fletching means a lost arrow, or worse, an arrow that flies wild and hits something or someone it was not meant to hit. Finally, all three pieces of fletching are bound. The fletcher holds the arrow up and examines it. The fletching stands out from the shaft, three veins of goose feather, white with brown markings, perfectly spaced, perfectly aligned. The silk bindings catch the light, spiraling along the quills like tiny ropes. But the work is not finished. The same process must be repeated for the other 6 arrows. The fletcher sets the first arrow aside and picks up the second shaft. Apply glue to the fletching. Position it on the shaft. Check alignment. Press it down. Bind with silk thread. Loop, pull, knot and trim. Move to the next fletching, and the next, and the next. 1 arrow done. 6 more to go. The sun is well up now, and the light streaming through the window has changed from the grey of dawn to the warmer gold of morning. The workshop is still cold, but the Fletcher's hands are warm from the work, from the constant motion of wrapping thread and tying knots. He works steadily, not stopping to rest, lost in the rhythm of the task. Arrow after arrow, fletching after fletching. The pile of finished arrows grows. By the time he completes the last one, it is nearly midday, and his stomach is reminding him that he has not eaten since last night. But he is almost done. The arrows have fletching now, and they look like proper arrows, but they still need their points. The bodkin points that were delivered yesterday by the blacksmith, long and narrow, designed to punch through the iron rings of mail armor or the layered linen of a gambeson. The Fletcher stands and stretches, feeling his back crack, and crosses to the door of the workshop. Outside, the day is clear and bright, the frost from this morning long since melted. He can see smoke rising from the chimney of his house, and he knows his wife is cooking. He will eat soon. But first, the points. He returns to the bench and picks up the small wooden box containing the bodkin points. He opens it and examines them. There are 7 points, 1 for each arrow. They are simple but deadly. A pyramidal head, about 2 inches long, tapering from a wide base to a sharp point. Behind the head is a socket, a hollow tube of metal into which the arrow shaft will fit. The socket is slightly tapered, wider at the base than at the open end. This taper is important. It will help create a tight fit between the point and the shaft, and it will distribute the stress of impact over a larger area, reducing the chance of the wood splitting. The Fletcher picks up one of the points and examines it closely. The metal is dark, covered in a thin layer of scale and oxidation from the forging process. He takes a piece of fine sand and begins to rub the socket, cleaning away the scale, exposing the bare metal underneath. The metal gleams dully in the light, grey-black, slightly pitted from the hammer blows that shaped it. He rubs until the socket is clean, then sets the point aside and picks up another, repeating the process. Clean the socket. Expose the metal. Set it aside. All 7 points cleaned and ready. Now he must fit the points to the shafts. This is one of the most critical steps in arrow making, because if the fit is not right, the point will either fall off in flight or crack the shaft on impact. The socket must be tight enough to hold the point securely, but not so tight that it splits the wood. The Fletcher picks up one of the arrows and examines the front end of the shaft, the end opposite the nock. The shaft is currently a perfect cylinder, the same diameter from end to end. But for the point to fit, the front end must be tapered, reduced in diameter so it will slide into the socket. He picks up his knife and begins to carefully pare away wood from the front of the shaft, removing thin slices, creating a gentle taper. He works slowly, checking the fit frequently by holding the socket of the point against the shaft and seeing how far it slides on. At first, the socket barely fits over the end of the shaft. More wood must be removed. He continues paring, the knife removing thin curls of ash, the taper growing longer. After a few minutes, he checks the fit again. The socket slides on further now, perhaps half an inch. Good progress, but not enough yet. He continues working, pairing and checking, pairing and checking. The taper must be gradual and even not stepped or lumpy. The fletcher can feel the shape through his fingers as he works, can sense where more wood needs to be removed. Finally, after perhaps 10 minutes of careful work, he achieves the fit he is looking for. The socket slides onto the tapered end of the shaft with firm resistance, tight enough that it does not wobble, but not so tight that it requires excessive force. He pushes the point on as far as it will go, then tries to twist it. It does not move. Perfect. But the fit alone is not enough to hold the point in place. The violence of release, the shock of impact, these forces can dislodge even a perfectly fitted point. The point must be glued in place, permanently fixed to the shaft. For this, the fletcher uses a different type of glue than the hide glue he used for the fletching. He uses pitch, a dark, sticky substance made from pine resin mixed with beeswax and a bit of charcoal. Pitch has several advantages over hide glue. It is waterproof, which is important because arrows are often used in rain or stored in damp conditions. It is also somewhat flexible, which allows it to absorb the shock of impact without cracking or shattering. And it is incredibly strong once it hardens, creating a bond that will last for years. The fletcher has a small pot of pitch sitting on the bench. The pitch is solid at room temperature, a hard black lump that looks almost like coal. He places the pot on the iron stand over a candle and lights the candle. The heat begins to soften the pitch, and after a few minutes it starts to melt, becoming liquid. The fletcher stirs it with a small stick, breaking up the solid mass, helping it liquefy. The smell of pine resin fills the workshop, sharp and clean, cutting through the other smells of wood and feather and hide glue. When the pitch is fully melted, hot and flowing, the fletcher removes the bodkin point from the shaft and uses a thin stick to apply pitch to the inside of the socket, coating it thoroughly. The pitch is dark and glossy, and it clings to the metal, forming a thick layer. Then he applies pitch to the tapered end of the shaft, covering the wood with the same thoroughness. He works quickly because pitch cools and hardens fast. It does not stay workable for long. Once both surfaces are coated with pitch, the fletcher takes the point and slides it onto the shaft, pushing it on firmly. The fit is tight, and the pitch squeezes out from the joint, thick and sticky. He continues pushing until the point is fully seated, the base of the socket flush against the shoulder of the taper. Excess pitch oozes out, and he wipes it away with a rag before it cools. Then he holds the arrow upright, point down, and taps the knock end lightly against the bench. The impact drives the point even more firmly onto the shaft, ensuring good contact between the metal and the wood, ensuring that the pitch fills every tiny gap and void. He sets the arrow aside, point up, and waits for the pitch to cool. It does not take long. In a minute or two, the pitch has hardened, transforming from a liquid to a solid, locking the point to the shaft with a bond stronger than the wood itself. The fletcher picks up the arrow and examines the joint. A thin ring of black pitch is visible where the socket meets the shaft, but otherwise the joint is clean and smooth. He tests it by trying to twist the point. It does not move. He tries to pull it off. It does not budge. The point is now a permanent part of the arrow, as fixed as if it had been forged from a single piece of metal and wood. He repeats the process for the remaining 6 arrows. Taper the shaft, check the fit, heat the pitch, apply it to the socket and the shaft, slide the point on, tap it tight, set it aside to cool. 1 arrow done, 6 more to go. The work is repetitive, almost mechanical, but the fletcher does not mind. Repetition is the foundation of craft. It is through repetition that skill is developed, that the hands learn to work without conscious thought. That perfection becomes not an accident but a habit. By the time he finishes attaching the last point, the light outside is beginning to fade. The day is nearly gone, and the fletcher realizes he has not eaten anything since last night. His stomach is empty, and there is a slight tremor in his hands from hunger and fatigue. But the arrows are almost complete. Just one more step, the final test, the spin. The Fletcher picks up one of the finished arrows and holds it horizontally in front of him. He positions the shaft on the nail of his left thumb, balancing it at a point about 1/3 of the way back from the point. This is the center of balance, the place where the weight of the point and the weight of the fletching and shaft are in equilibrium. Then, with his right hand, he gives the arrow a quick spin, flicking it with his fingers. The arrow rotates on his thumbnail, spinning smoothly. He watches it carefully, his eyes focused on the shaft, looking for any wobble or deviation. The arrow spins true. No wobble, no hesitation. The shaft remains perfectly horizontal, the rotation smooth and even. This is what he is looking for. A perfectly balanced arrow with the point, the shaft, and the fletching all working together in harmony. If the arrow wobbles, it means something is wrong. Perhaps the shaft is not straight. Perhaps the fletching is not aligned correctly. Perhaps the point is too heavy or too light. A wobbling arrow will not fly true. It will drift off course, affected by the slightest breeze, tumbling in the air like a stick thrown by a child. But this arrow does not wobble. It spins perfectly, and after a few seconds the Fletcher stops it with his hand and sets it aside. Good. He picks up the next arrow and repeats the test. Spin, watch, check for wobble. This one also spins true, and the next, and the next. All 7 arrows pass the spin test, all 7 are perfectly balanced. The Fletcher allows himself a small smile. This is good work. These arrows will fly straight and fast. They will do what they are meant to do. He sets the arrows in the rack on the bench and steps back, looking at them. 7 arrows, completed from start to finish over the course of 2 days. 7 shafts of ash, planed and sanded and scraped until they are perfectly smooth. 7 bodkin points, fitted and glued with pitch. 7 knocks, cut and reinforced with horn. 21 pieces of goose feather fletching, split and shaped and singed and bound with silk thread. Each arrow identical to the next, each one a masterpiece of precision and craft. The Fletcher does not often feel pride in his work. Pride is a luxury, something for people who have time to reflect on what they have accomplished. But looking at these arrows, he feels something close to it, a sense of satisfaction, a sense of completion. But the work is not quite finished. The arrows must be bundled for delivery. The standard bundle is a sheaf, 24 arrows bound together with linen cloth. The Fletcher has 7 arrows, not 24, but the customer has ordered more, and these 7 will be added to the sheaf when the rest are completed. For now, though, they must be protected, kept safe from moisture and damage until they are delivered. The Fletcher crosses to a shelf on the wall and takes down a piece of linen cloth. It is a simple weave, undyed, rough to the touch. He spreads the cloth on the bench and arranges the 7 arrows on it, parallel to each other, the points all facing the same direction. Then he rolls the cloth around the arrows, creating a tight bundle. The cloth will protect the fletching from being crushed and will keep moisture away from the shafts and the glue joints. He ties the bundle with a length of string, securing it at both ends, and sets it aside. The workshop falls silent. The candles have burned down to stubs, and the light is fading fast. Outside, the sun has set, and the sky is turning from blue to purple to black. The Fletcher blows out the candles, and the workshop is plunged into darkness. He stands there for a moment, letting his eyes adjust, breathing in the familiar smells of the place. Wood and glue and pitch and feather. The smells of his life, the smells of his craft. Then he turns and walks to the door, stepping out into the cold evening air. The stars are beginning to appear, pinpricks of light in the darkening sky. The Fletcher crosses the courtyard to his house, where the warmth of the fire and the smell of food await him. His wife has made a stew, thick with barley and root vegetables and a bit of salted pork. She ladles it into a bowl and hands it to him, and he sits at the table and eats slowly, savoring each bite. They do not talk much. There is nothing that needs to be said. The work is done for now. Tomorrow there will be more arrows to make, more shafts to plane, more fletching to bind. But tonight the work is done. After he eats, the Fletcher sits by the fire for a while, warming his hands, letting the heat seep into his bones. He thinks about the arrows, about where they will go. The sheaf will be delivered to the Lord's steward, who will store them in the armory until they are needed. And then, when the call comes, when the Lord musters his men for war or for a hunt, the arrows will be distributed. Each archer will be given a sheaf, 24 arrows, to carry in his quiver. And those arrows will be loosed at targets near or far, at deer in the forest or men on a battlefield. The Fletcher does not dwell on this. He cannot afford to think too much about the use to which his work is put. If he did, if he thought about the men who would fall to these arrows, about the wives who would become widows and the children who would become orphans, he would go mad. So he focuses on the craft itself, on the process of transformation, on the satisfaction of taking raw materials and creating something functional and beautiful. That is his job. That is what he does. Eventually, he makes his way to bed. The house is quiet, the fire burning low. His wife is already asleep, her breathing slow and regular. The Fletcher lies down beside her and closes his eyes. He is tired, bone tired, the kind of tired that comes from a full day of focused work. But it is a good tiredness, earned and honest. He thinks about the arrows one more time, sees them in his mind's eye, standing in their rack, perfect and ready. And then he thinks of nothing at all, and he sleeps. He dreams of feathers, of geese flying in formation across a grey sky, their wings beating in unison, of feathers falling like snow, drifting down to cover the earth, of the quills splitting under the knife, the soft, cracking sound, the two halves falling apart, of the spiral of silk thread, looping and pulling, binding the fletching to the shaft. Loop, pull, loop, pull. The rhythm continues in his sleep, a heartbeat, a meditation, the sound of his life's work. And in the workshop, the bundle of arrows sits in the corner, wrapped in linen, tied with string. 7 arrows, balanced and true. 7 shafts of ash that were once part of a tree, growing in a forest somewhere, reaching toward the sun. 7 bodkin points that were once chunks of iron ore, pulled from the earth and smelted and forged. 21 feathers that were once part of living geese, flying and feeding and living their lives before ending up in a farmer's yard. All of these things, brought together by the Fletcher's hands, transformed into tools of precision and purpose. The arrows do not know what they will become. They do not know whose hand will draw the bowstring, whose eye will sight down their length, whose target they will find. They are simply arrows waiting in the darkness, ready for whatever comes next. And the Fletcher, sleeping in his bed, does not know either. He has done his part. He has taken the raw materials of the world and shaped them into something useful, something that will serve a purpose, whether noble or terrible. That is all any craftsman can do. The night deepens. The stars wheel overhead, following their ancient paths. In the workshop, the bundle of arrows waits. In the house, the Fletcher sleeps and dreams of feathers and wood and the perfect line. The work is done, and the world is quiet. Tomorrow there will be more work, more arrows to make, more shafts to plane and points to fit and fletching to bind. But tonight there is only rest. The moon rises, full and bright, casting silver light through the window of the workshop. The light falls on the bundle of arrows, illuminating the linen wrapping, creating shadows that shift and dance as clouds pass across the moon. The arrows are patient. They have no choice but to be. They are inanimate things, wood and metal and feather, given purpose by human hands, but possessing no will of their own. They will go where they are sent, do what they are made to do, serve the purpose for which they were created. And somewhere in a castle or a manor house, a lord is planning. He is looking at maps, discussing strategy with his advisors, preparing for a campaign or a battle or a siege. He is counting his men, assessing his resources, and among those resources are arrows. Thousands of arrows, made by hundreds of Fletchers in workshops scattered across the countryside. Each arrow identical to the next, each one a product of the same careful process, the same attention to detail, the same commitment to craft. The Lord does not know the names of the Fletchers who made his arrows. He does not care. To him, the arrows are simply tools, commodities to be purchased and stored and expended when needed. But to the Fletcher, each arrow is more than that. Each arrow is a piece of his life, a tangible record of time spent and skill applied. Each arrow represents hours of work, from selecting the wood to fitting the point to binding the fletching. Each arrow is a small act of creation, a transformation of base materials into something refined and purposeful. The Fletcher may not think of it in these terms. He may not philosophize about the nature of his work or contemplate its deeper meaning. But he knows, in some inarticulate way, that what he does matters, that it has value beyond the few pennies he is paid. The night wears on. The moon continues its journey across the sky. In the workshop, nothing moves. The bundle of arrows sits in the corner, silent and still. The tools hang on their pegs, waiting to be used again. The bench, scarred and pitted from years of work, waits for the next shaft to be planed, the next point to be fitted. Everything is in its place, everything ready for the cycle to begin again. And in the house, the Fletcher sleeps deeply, dreamlessly now. His body is recovering from the day's work, his muscles relaxing, his mind quiet. He does not know what tomorrow will bring. Another order for arrows, perhaps, or a day of rest if the weather turns bad, or news from the wider world, reports of battles fought and won and lost. He does not worry about it. Tomorrow will come when it comes, and he will deal with it then. For now, there is only sleep, and the darkness, and the quiet breathing of his wife beside him. The hours pass. The moon sets, and the sky begins to lighten in the east. Dawn is approaching, the beginning of another day. Soon the Fletcher will wake and rise and cross to the workshop to begin again. More wood to select, more shafts to plane, more fletching to bind. The work is never finished, never complete. There is always another arrow to be made, another customer to satisfy, another deadline to meet. This is the life of a craftsman, an endless cycle of creation and delivery and creation again. But for now, in these last quiet hours before dawn, the world is at peace. The arrows sit in their bundle, balanced and true. The Fletcher sleeps in his bed, his work done for the day. The workshop waits in the darkness, patient and silent. Everything is as it should be. Everything is in order. And as the sheaves stand ready in the corner, balanced and true, the workshop falls silent. The work is done, and you are safe. Sleep well.